9 justices, 1 decision. And in a single sentence, they may have just shaken the foundation of every gun law in America. What they said wasn't loud, but it was explosive. In a landmark 9-0 decision, the Supreme Court issued a ruling that on the surface had nothing to do with gun control. But buried within the legal reasoning lies a powerful statement that could ripple across every state with strict firearm regulations. The justices reaffirmed a broad interpretation of constitutional protections that, when applied to the Second Amendment, may weaken the foundation of current assault weapon bans. Legal analysts are already calling it a quiet earthquake, a decision whose full force will only be felt over time. The ruling emphasized that rights recognized by the Constitution cannot be limited through political convenience or selective interpretation. Although the case itself was not centered on firearms, the court's unanimous language signals a renewed commitment to protecting individual liberties from government overreach. For states that have built extensive frameworks around firearm restrictions, this precedent poses serious questions about sustainability and legality. It suggests that any law infringing on ownership of commonly used weapons could face immediate constitutional challenges. What began as a seemingly unrelated case has now become a potential turning point, one that redefines the balance between regulation, freedom, and the enduring weight of the Bill of Rights. Governor Tim Walz has called a special legislative session in Minnesota, a move that has sparked intense debate across the political spectrum. Officially, the session is framed as an emergency effort to address public safety and gun reform, but critics argue that it represents a pre-planned push to fast-track sweeping legislation with minimal discussion or public oversight. Scheduled for October 6th to 12th, 2025, the session limits the ability of lawmakers to introduce amendments unless every caucus leader agrees, a condition that effectively narrows debate and consolidates control. Supporters describe this approach as efficient governance in a time of urgency, claiming it allows lawmakers to act decisively on issues that have been delayed for too long. Opponents, however, see it as a procedural shortcut designed to silence dissent and move controversial measures through without scrutiny. They warn that bypassing traditional checks and balances could set a dangerous precedent for future legislative actions, regardless of political affiliation. By restricting the scope of discussion to gun-related policies and safety measures, the session has become a flashpoint in the broader national conversation about rights, governance, and the limits of executive influence in the legislative process. The proposed legislative package is extensive, touching nearly every aspect of firearm ownership and regulation within the state. It seeks to redefine what citizens can own, how they may use those firearms, and whether they can legally build or modify them. Supporters argue that the measures are necessary to modernize public safety laws and reduce potential risks, while opponents view them as an unprecedented expansion of government authority into private life. The bill includes a ban on AR-15-style rifles and other semi-automatic weapons, criminal penalties for magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, and new restrictions on accessories such as binary triggers, bump stocks, and forced reset triggers. It also prohibits the sale or possession of 80% lower receivers and other unfinished firearm kits, effectively eliminating private firearm assembly. In addition, the legislation allocates significant funding toward public education and enforcement initiatives, ensuring that the new laws are widely promoted and tightly controlled. Critics warn that the scope of these measures could turn law-abiding gun owners into felons overnight, not because of their actions, but because of the items they already possess. To them, it represents not regulation, but a fundamental shift in how the state defines legality, responsibility, and individual freedom. The constitutional implications of the proposed legislation are already drawing intense scrutiny from legal scholars and civil rights advocates. Opponents argue that the measures violate multiple protections enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, most notably the Second Amendment's guarantee of the right to keep and bear arms. They point to past Supreme Court rulings that affirmed the ownership of weapons in common use for lawful purposes, claiming that the new bans directly contradict those precedents. Beyond the Second Amendment, critics contend that the rushed legislative process raises serious concerns about due process and democratic transparency. By limiting debate and amendments, they say the state government is not only restricting gun rights, but also undermining the procedural rights of its own citizens. Supporters of the bill counter that it falls well within the bounds of legislative authority, arguing that the government has both the power and responsibility to enact measures that protect public safety. Still, the tension lies in the fine line between governance and overreach. Legal experts predict that if the law passes, it will face immediate court challenges, potentially setting the stage for a landmark judicial battle that could redefine how constitutional rights are interpreted in the modern era. The concept of the assault weapon has long been one of the most misleading terms in modern politics, and now courts are finally beginning to dismantle it. Legally and historically, there is no clear definition of an assault weapon. The term was created for political optics, not legal clarity. Under previous Supreme Court rulings, including District of Columbia versus Heller, 2008, and Bruin, 2022, firearms that are in common use for lawful purposes are constitutionally protected. The AR-15, owned by over 24 million Americans, clearly falls into that category. Yet the Minnesota proposal seeks to ban these rifles based not on their function, but on their appearance, targeting features like pistol grips, collapsible stocks, or flash suppressors. None of these alter the firearm's basic operation, but they make it politically convenient to demonize. Legal analysts argue that such bans fail the Bruin test, which requires that any firearm regulation be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of gun laws. In short, cosmetic restrictions have no historical precedent. This means that not only is the assault weapon labeled deceptive, but it's also legally indefensible, and courts are increasingly recognizing that fact across multiple states. The most dangerous part of this bill isn't what it promises for the future. It's what it does to people right now. Overnight, millions of ordinary, law-abiding gun owners could become felons without ever committing a crime. There's no gradual phase-in, no meaningful grace period, and no compensation for confiscated property. The law demands surrender, destruction, or removal of certain firearms and magazines immediately upon enactment. That means a veteran who's owned his AR-15 for decades, a single mother who keeps one for home defense, or a competitive shooter who built his rifle legally. All would suddenly be in violation of the law simply for possession. This isn't regulation, it's criminalization by decree. The bill provides no buyback program, no registration workaround, and no protection for those caught unaware. It redefines peaceful ownership as a felony, turning responsible citizens into targets for prosecution. Legal experts warn that this kind of legislation sets a dangerous precedent, where the government doesn't just restrict future purchases, but rewrites the past, erasing lawful ownership overnight. It's not just unconstitutional. It's an attack on the very idea that citizens have stable, predictable rights under the rule of law. This is more than a policy fight. It's a defining moment for freedom in America. What happens next will decide whether the Constitution still protects the people, or whether government fear and political theater will redefine our rights by force. The 9-0 Supreme Court ruling wasn't just a legal opinion. It was a warning shot, a reminder that the Second Amendment still stands, and it stands for everyone. But rulings mean nothing without vigilance. If citizens stay silent, lawmakers will keep pushing unconstitutional agendas, confident no one will resist. Now is the time to act. Not tomorrow, not after the headlines fade. Stay informed, speak out, and hold your representatives accountable. Share this message with every responsible gun owner who still believes in liberty, due process, and the rule of law. The battle for your rights doesn't end in court. It begins in the public square and with your voice. Because once freedom is lost, it doesn't return easily. This isn't the end of the fight. It's the start of a new chapter. Stand firm, stay alert, and never forget, your rights aren't granted by the government. They're protected by the Constitution and defended by you.